Look closely at the laws protecting your retirement today. That financial safety net only exists because of a catastrophic industrial tragedy. For over a century, the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana, stood as an absolute titan of American manufacturing. It was a roaring 100-acre beast that fueled the Union Army and defined the post-war automotive boom. Generations of loyal workers traded their sweat for the promise of a secure future. But in December 1963, the corporate executives executed a ruthless financial betrayal. They permanently killed the assembly lines and locked the factory doors. It was not just the sudden death of an iconic brand. It was the complete financial destruction of 7,000 families, triggering the most devastating pension collapse in United States history. How did a corporation so powerful get away with abandoning the very people who built it? Chapter 1. Origins in the Wagon Shop. In the mid-19th century, America was a nation defined by movement. The frontier was pushing westward at a relentless pace, and the arteries of this expansion were forged in iron, wood, and sweat. In 1852, two brothers named Henry and Clement Studebaker opened a modest blacksmith and wagon shop in South Bend, Indiana. They possessed a meager capital of $68, 2 sets of rudimentary tools, and a strong work ethic. Their initial ambition was strictly local, aiming to build sturdy, reliable wagons for farmers and merchants in the surrounding counties. They could not have foreseen that their small forge would lay the foundation for an industrial empire that would endure for more than a century. The Studebaker brothers quickly built a reputation for uncompromising quality. A Studebaker wagon was engineered to survive the grueling journey across the Rocky Mountains or the punishing, rutted trails of the Great Plains. This reputation for extreme durability soon caught the attention of the federal government. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, the demand for transport vehicles skyrocketed overnight. The Union Army desperately needed supply wagons, artillery carts, and ambulances that could withstand the brutality of warfare while navigating treacherous, muddy terrain. Studebaker secured massive, lucrative government contracts. This influx of capital and guaranteed demand transformed their local operation into a major manufacturing powerhouse. The immense wealth generated from these military contracts fueled unprecedented expansion in South Bend. By the time the war concluded, Studebaker was no longer a simple blacksmith shop. The company brought in 3 more brothers, John, Peter, and Jacob, solidifying the enterprise as a formidable family dynasty. They aggressively mechanized their production lines, adopting sequential assembly techniques that were highly advanced for the era. By the late 1880s, the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company had officially become the largest producer of horse-drawn vehicles in the world. Their massive factory complex in South Bend covered nearly 100 acres of land, with lumber yards so vast they held millions of board feet of drying timber. They employed thousands of skilled woodworkers, wheelwrights, and iron smiths. The factory produced an astonishing variety of products, ranging from heavy freight wagons and rugged farm equipment to luxurious, custom-built carriages for the urban elite. The name Studebaker became a household word across the United States, representing American industrial might and trusted by pioneers, farmers, and presidents alike. Yet, as the 19th century drew to a close, a quiet technological revolution was brewing. The air in American cities began to smell less of horses and manure, and more of oil and gasoline. A strange, noisy contraption called the automobile was making its debut on dirt roads and cobblestone streets. Many established carriage makers dismissed the motor car as a passing fad for wealthy eccentrics, a dangerous toy that could never truly replace the absolute reliability of a good horse. The Studebaker leadership, however, saw the writing on the wall. Guided by executives who understood the shifting tides of transportation, they faced a monumental, terrifying decision. They could stubbornly cling to their absolute dominance in the wagon market, enjoying massive guaranteed profits while hoping the gasoline engine would ultimately fail. Or they could risk the entire 50-year legacy of their family name on a volatile, unproven technology. The transition was methodical but bold. They initially tested the waters by producing electric vehicles in 1902, cautiously exploring the new concept of horseless mobility. However, they quickly realized that the range and power of the internal combustion engine dictated the true future of transportation. In 1904, Studebaker made a decisive move, partnering with an external manufacturer to produce gasoline-powered cars bearing the Studebaker nameplate. This was an existential gamble. They were taking a beloved, world-renowned legacy of horse-drawn transport and tying it directly to a chaotic, rapidly evolving new industry. It was a leap of faith that required completely retooling their massive South Bend factories, retraining thousands of veteran craftsmen, and slowly abandoning the very product that had made them millionaires. As the new century unfolded, the leaders of Studebaker stood at the precipice of an unknown era. They had completely conquered the age of the horse and wagon. Now, they were betting their entire empire that they could survive the harsh, mechanical realities of the automobile age. Chapter 2: Surviving the Great Depression. By the late 1920s, Studebaker had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from horse-drawn wagons to gasoline-powered automobiles. Under the aggressive leadership of President Albert Russell Erskine, the company expanded rapidly. Erskine was a man of grand visions. He acquired the luxury automaker Pierce Arrow and pushed Studebaker to produce smaller, more affordable cars under different brand names. He also insisted on paying generous dividends to shareholders, projecting an image of unshakable financial health. The massive factories in South Bend hummed with constant activity, and the company seemed completely invincible. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed, taking the American economy down with it. As the Great Depression settled over the nation, car sales plummeted. Families who once dreamed of upgrading their vehicles now struggled to put food on the table. For Studebaker, the timing of the economic collapse was catastrophic. Erskine had depleted the company cash reserves to pay those high dividends, leaving Studebaker dangerously exposed to the sudden downturn. When the banks finally came calling for their loans, the automaker had nothing left to give. By March 1933, the situation reached a breaking point. Studebaker, an industrial giant that had survived the Civil War and the death of the horse-drawn era, was forced into receivership. The company was functionally bankrupt and buried under massive debt. The emotional toll was devastating for everyone involved. Recognizing the ruin he had brought to the company he loved, Albert Russell Erskine tragically took his own life later that year. The city of South Bend braced for the absolute worst. Thousands of workers faced the terrifying prospect of losing their livelihoods in the middle of the most severe economic crisis in modern history. But the story of Studebaker did not end in 1933. The federal court appointed two company vice presidents, Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance, to act as receivers. They were handed a nearly impossible task. They had to somehow keep the factories running, pay off the crushing debt, and convince a terrified public to buy cars from a bankrupt manufacturer. Hoffman, a brilliant salesman, and Vance, a pragmatic manufacturing expert, possessed exactly the combination of skills needed for a miracle. Their first move was ruthless, but entirely necessary. They immediately sold off the Pierce Arrow division, shedding the luxury burden that was actively bleeding cash. They slashed administrative costs and restructured the manufacturing process to squeeze every ounce of efficiency from the South Bend facilities. Most importantly, Hoffman hit the road. He traveled relentlessly across the country, meeting with nervous dealers and convincing them to stick with the brand. He promised them that Studebaker was not dead and that a new revolutionary car was on the way. That promise materialized in 1939 with the introduction of the Studebaker Champion. Hoffman and Vance understood that the post-Depression consumer needed something radically different. The Champion was a masterpiece of market timing and engineering. It was lightweight, fuel-efficient, and incredibly affordable. Priced starting at just $660. Designed with clean lines, it looked completely different from the heavy, boxy cars of the early 1930s. The Champion was a massive gamble for the company. They spent a fortune on its development and tooling, essentially betting their remaining existence on its success in the consumer market. If the Champion failed, the factory doors in South Bend would close forever. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The Champion was exactly the car America needed. It offered incredible gas mileage at a time when every penny counted, yet it still provided the comfort and reliability long associated with the Studebaker name. Sales skyrocketed almost overnight. In its first full year of production, the Champion pushed Studebaker profits to new heights, allowing the company to finally emerge from receivership. Hoffman and Vance had pulled off one of the greatest corporate rescue missions in American business history. They took a bankrupt, demoralized company and transformed it back into a highly profitable, independent automaker. As the 1930s drew to a close, Studebaker was not just surviving, it was thriving. The assembly lines in South Bend were running at full capacity once again, and the workforce felt a renewed sense of pride and security. They had stared into the abyss of the Great Depression and emerged much stronger. However, the world was about to change again, and Studebaker would soon face an entirely different kind of global challenge. Chapter 3: The Post-War Golden Age. When World War II came to a close in 1945, the United States entered an era of unprecedented economic expansion. Millions of soldiers returned home, eager to start families, buy houses in the newly expanding suburbs, and purchase new automobiles. The entire automotive industry scrambled to meet this explosive demand, but most major companies simply resumed production of their outdated pre-war models. Studebaker, however, saw a rare opportunity to leap ahead of the massive competition. Under the continued leadership of Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance, the company unveiled a daring and highly secretive strategy. They had discreetly continued design work during the war years, when domestic car production was strictly halted by the government. This foresight allowed them to introduce a completely new, genuinely modern automobile, long before their massive rivals in Detroit could retool their own factories. In 1947, Studebaker shocked the automotive world with the introduction of its revolutionary new lineup. The company marketing campaign boldly proclaimed that it was first by far with a post-war car. The breathtaking design was heavily influenced by the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy and his brilliant internal team, particularly the visionary Virgil Exner. The new Studebakers featured flush fenders, expansive glass areas that provided unprecedented visibility, and a sleek, aerodynamic profile that made everything else on the road look instantly obsolete. The styling was so forward-thinking and perfectly symmetrical that a popular national joke at the time questioned whether the new Studebaker was coming or going. The American public was absolutely captivated by this glimpse of the future. People lined up around the block at local dealerships just to get a chance to see the cars in person. Sales immediately exploded, shattering previous company records and pushing Studebaker to the very forefront of American automotive innovation. The overwhelming success of these post-war models ushered in a golden era, not just for the corporate boardroom, but for the entire city of South Bend, Indiana. The massive manufacturing complex, which had once churned out wooden wagons, was now a roaring engine of modern industrial power. The plant ran at maximum capacity, operating in continuous 24-hour shifts to keep up with the seemingly insatiable consumer demand. For the thousands of men and women employed at Studebaker, the factory was much more than just a place to earn a weekly paycheck. It was the undisputed economic backbone of the entire community and the surrounding counties. Generations of the same local families worked side by side on the bustling assembly lines. Fathers trained their sons in the art of metalwork and assembly, and the company actively fostered a deep, enduring sense of loyalty and corporate paternalism. Studebaker workers enjoyed some of the highest hourly wages and most generous benefit packages available in the entire American manufacturing sector. The massive employee parking lots outside the South Bend facility were constantly overflowing with the very cars the workers were building, serving as a visible testament to the thriving middle-class lifestyle that the company made entirely possible. It was a time of immense civic pride and unparalleled prosperity. As the decade turned from the 1940s into the early 1950s, Studebaker reached the absolute zenith of its industrial power and cultural influence. In 1950, the company introduced the iconic and highly controversial bullet nose design, further solidifying its hard-earned reputation for bold, futuristic styling that refused to play by conventional rules. Production numbers soared past 300,000 units in a single year, bringing in record-breaking revenue. The leadership team in South Bend looked at their soaring profit margins, their state-of-the-art vehicle designs, and their fiercely dedicated union workforce, and they felt an overwhelming sense of industrial invincibility. They genuinely believed they had permanently secured their place among the elite automotive manufacturers of the world. They were no longer just surviving the harsh realities of the automotive business, they were actively setting the aesthetic and engineering standard for the entire industry. Flush with cash reserves and overflowing with institutional confidence, Studebaker felt completely prepared to directly challenge the massive, seemingly unstoppable corporations dominating Detroit. They had the creative talent, they had the undeniable market momentum, and they had the unwavering support of their local workforce. The future looked incredibly bright from the top floor of the administration building, but this supreme confidence unfortunately masked deep underlying vulnerabilities that were about to be brutally exposed in a rapidly changing and fiercely unforgiving marketplace. Chapter 4: The Ruthless War with the Big Three. As the 1950s dawned, the post-war honeymoon for American independent automakers came to a sudden and violent end. The pent-up consumer demand that had fueled Studebaker to record profits was finally beginning to level off. The giant corporations in Detroit had fully awakened from their post-war slumber and retooled their massive factories. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were no longer content with simply sharing the market with smaller independent brands. They wanted total domination. A brutal, unprecedented production and price war erupted, primarily driven by a fierce rivalry between General Motors and Ford. Henry Ford II had recently taken control of his grandfather's company and was determined to reclaim the #1 sales spot from Chevrolet. To achieve this ambitious goal, Ford flooded the national dealership network with thousands of cars. They severely cut wholesale prices and essentially forced local dealers to sell vehicles at razor-thin margins, or even at a loss just to move the metal and hit aggressive sales quotas. General Motors immediately retaliated with its own massive overproduction strategy, utilizing its unparalleled financial resources to outmuscle Ford. This clash of the titans created an absolute bloodbath for smaller, independent manufacturers like Studebaker. They simply did not have the economies of scale to compete in a prolonged war of financial attrition. While Ford and General Motors could easily absorb temporary losses in certain divisions to secure long-term market share, Studebaker relied on every single sale just to keep the lights on in South Bend. Furthermore, Studebaker was fighting this war with a severe internal handicap. The very corporate culture that had made the company a beloved local institution was now slowly killing it. During the highly profitable years, management had consistently chosen the path of least resistance. They negotiated extremely generous union contracts to avoid any strikes or production delays when consumer demand was high. As a direct result, the hourly labor wages and benefit costs at the South Bend plant were significantly higher than the industry average in Detroit. The structural problems ran even deeper than the payroll. The workforce was older and deeply entrenched, meaning pension obligations were massive and growing every year. The factory itself, while historically significant and massive in scale, was a sprawling, multi-story complex spread across regular city streets. It was incredibly inefficient compared to the modern single-story assembly plants being built by the Big Three on vast tracts of empty land. In South Bend, heavy automotive parts had to be moved via slow elevators and specialized transport trucks between different buildings. This convoluted manufacturing process added hidden logistical costs to every single vehicle that rolled off the assembly line. The financial mathematics of this situation were completely unsustainable. For a massive corporation like Ford or General Motors, the break-even point for profitability was relatively low due to their massive volume and highly efficient production lines. For Studebaker, the break-even point was terrifyingly high. They needed to sell an enormous number of cars just to cover their bloated corporate overhead and expensive labor contracts. As the Detroit price war drove retail prices down across the country, the profit margin on a Studebaker vehicle virtually evaporated. Even when they managed to sell a car, they were barely making any real money on the transaction. Management desperately tried to hold the line by emphasizing their superior styling and engineering heritage, but the American consumer was becoming increasingly price-conscious. A shiny new Ford or Chevrolet was suddenly hundreds of dollars cheaper than a comparable Studebaker. For most middle-class families, that upfront price difference was simply impossible to ignore, regardless of brand loyalty. By the end of 1953, the escalating crisis could no longer be hidden behind optimistic marketing campaigns or nostalgic public relations. Sales figures plummeted at an alarming rate as the Detroit giants aggressively stole market share from the independents. The assembly lines in South Bend began to slow down, and the once overflowing employee parking lots started to show terrifying empty spaces. The financial reports landing on the desks of the Studebaker executives were heavily painted in deep, terrifying red ink. The company was losing millions of dollars in a matter of months. Panic began to set in at the highest levels of the corporation. The executives who had confidently steered the company through the Great Depression suddenly realized they were completely outmatched. It became painfully clear to the board of directors that the era of the highly profitable independent automaker was effectively over. Studebaker could no longer stand alone. They desperately needed a partner to share costs, leading them directly toward the most fateful and devastating decision in the entire history of the company. Chapter 5. The Disastrous Merger. By 1954, the situation in South Bend had deteriorated from a mere financial challenge to a full-blown existential crisis. The ruthless price war orchestrated by Ford and General Motors had severely crippled the independent automakers. Studebaker leadership recognized that their standalone business model was no longer viable in a landscape dominated by corporate giants. They desperately needed an alliance. The answer seemed to lie in a strategic partnership with another venerable name in American automotive history. Packard was a legendary luxury brand based in Detroit, known for building some of the most prestigious and mechanically refined vehicles in the world. On paper, a marriage between these two historic companies made perfect strategic sense. Studebaker possessed a massive manufacturing footprint and a vast network of mid-market dealerships, while Packard brought an aura of high-end prestige, advanced engineering capabilities, and lucrative defense contracts. The executives believed that by combining their resources, They could create the fourth largest automotive corporation in the United States, a unified front capable of absorbing the brutal blows dealt by the Big Three. In October 1954, the newly formed Studebaker Corporation was officially born. The announcement was met with a wave of optimistic press coverage and a brief surge of hope among the thousands of nervous factory workers in Indiana and Michigan. However, the rosy projections presented in the corporate boardrooms masked a terrifying reality. Due to an astonishing lack of due diligence, the executives from both sides had grossly misrepresented their true financial health prior to the merger. The integration process quickly revealed a devastating truth. Studebaker executives discovered that Packard was not the financially stable luxury powerhouse they had imagined. Packard was drowning in a sea of hidden debt. Their once legendary Detroit factories were hopelessly antiquated, and their exclusive dealership network was rapidly collapsing. Conversely, Packard leadership was horrified to learn the true extent of the bloated labor costs and crippling break-even point at the South Bend plant. It became painfully obvious that they had not formed a powerful new automotive empire. Instead, they had simply lashed two sinking ships together in the middle of a violent financial storm. The anticipated synergies never materialized. The two companies operated with entirely different corporate cultures, incompatible manufacturing systems, and conflicting engineering philosophies. Rather than sharing costs and streamlining production, the newly merged entity found itself burning through cash at an incredibly accelerated rate. The defense contracts that Studebaker had heavily relied upon to offset their automotive losses were suddenly canceled by the federal government, further plunging the new corporation into a catastrophic financial hole. By 1956, just 2 years after the celebrated merger, the Studebaker Corporation was losing over $50 million a year. The banks, sensing an imminent collapse, completely cut off their lines of credit. The ambitious dream of challenging Ford and General Motors had dissolved into a desperate scramble for basic survival. To avoid immediate bankruptcy, the board of directors was forced to make a humiliating deal with the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, an aviation company brought in specifically to restructure the failing Automaker. Under this brutal new management arrangement, Packard production was unceremoniously ripped out of Detroit and consolidated into the already inefficient South Bend facilities. The proud Packard nameplate was slapped onto heavily modified Studebaker chassis, resulting in awkward, poorly designed cars that the automotive press mockingly dubbed Packard Bakers. This desperate cost-cutting measure completely destroyed the remaining prestige of the luxury brand and alienated their last remaining loyal customers. The merger, which was supposed to be the ultimate saving grace for both historic companies, had instead accelerated their mutual destruction. They were trapped in a death spiral of plummeting sales, massive operational losses, and a rapidly decaying public image. The executive leadership had gambled the entire legacy of two iconic American brands on a fundamentally flawed business arrangement, and they had lost everything. The control of the company was slipping away from the car builders and landing squarely in the hands of financial managers who viewed the automotive division not as a proud manufacturing heritage, but as a bleeding financial liability that needed to be surgically removed. Chapter 6: Power Falls to the Financiers. By the late 1950s, the grim reality of the automotive market had completely overwhelmed the executive offices in South Bend. The Packard brand was effectively dead, and the core Studebaker car division was hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable rate. Desperate to avoid total liquidation, the board of directors turned away from automotive engineers and sought salvation from Wall Street. The era of men who understood manufacturing and factory floors came to an abrupt end. They were replaced by corporate turnaround specialists, men who viewed car manufacturing purely as data points on a complex balance sheet. The new philosophy dictated from the top was simple and brutal. If the company could no longer compete with the Detroit giants in building automobiles, they would simply stop relying on automobiles to survive. Thus began a frantic and heavily criticized era of corporate diversification. The leadership team, guided by their new financial advisors and investment bankers, embarked on a massive buying spree using whatever tax loss carry-forwards and credit they could still secure. They began acquiring companies that had absolutely nothing to do with automotive manufacturing. In a matter of a few short years, the historic Studebaker Corporation found itself owning a dizzying array of completely unrelated and random businesses. They bought Gravely Tractors, a successful manufacturer of small lawn equipment. They acquired Clark Floor Machine Company and the Franklin Manufacturing Company, a firm that produced home appliances like refrigerators and freezers. They bought the STP Chemical Company, which produced automotive additives. They even purchased Trans International Airlines, a charter aviation service operating out of California. The ultimate goal was to build a highly diversified conglomerate, where the steady profits from these smaller businesses could offset the massive, continuous losses generated by the South Bend car plant. However, this strategy of aggressive diversification contained a fatal flaw that would seal the fate of the company. While the financial managers were busy acquiring airlines and appliance factories, the automotive division was deliberately starved of resources. The lifeblood of any successful car company is continuous research and development. To stay competitive, a manufacturer must constantly design new engines, engineer safer chassis, and refresh vehicle styling. But the Wall Street executives viewed research and development not as a vital investment for the future, but as an immediate expense to be slashed to protect quarterly earnings. Funding for completely new car models was virtually eliminated. The talented engineers and designers who remained in South Bend were forced to work absolute miracles with a near zero budget. They spent their days endlessly modifying and facelifting the exact same aging car platforms year after year, desperately trying to make old engineering look new. As a direct result of this systemic financial neglect, the quality and overall market appeal of Studebaker automobiles plummeted rapidly. The cars rolling off the South Bend assembly line in the early 1960s looked visibly tired and fundamentally outdated when placed next to the sleek, heavily funded modern offerings from Ford and General Motors. Consumers were not easily fooled, and they quickly noticed the sharp decline in innovation. Dealerships across the country, which had already suffered deeply through the Packard merger disaster, began to defect in massive numbers. Showrooms that had proudly displayed the Studebaker logo for decades were quietly rebadged as Chevrolet, Chrysler, or Ford franchises. The loss of these independent dealers was absolutely catastrophic. A car manufacturer simply cannot survive without a strong, motivated network to sell and service its vehicles locally. Every single time a dealer closed its doors or switched to a rival brand, Studebaker permanently lost access to another crucial local market. The financial executives in charge seemed completely disconnected from this grim reality on the ground. They were entirely focused on managing their new conglomerate portfolio and maximizing tax advantages, utterly failing to notice that their core historical business was rotting from the inside out. They failed to understand that building successful automobiles requires genuine passion, long-term vision, and a deep, uncompromising commitment to the final product. By treating the massive South Bend factory merely as a convenient tax write-off or a persistent financial problem to be managed, they guaranteed its eventual destruction. The shift in power from passionate manufacturers to detached accountants had completely hollowed out the soul of the company. The proud legacy of the founding brothers, built on a century of dedication to quality and durability, had been traded for short-term financial maneuvering. The corporation was surviving on paper, but on the factory floor, the irreversible collapse had already begun. Chapter 7. Desperate Attempts at Revival. As the 1950s drew to a close, the automotive division of the sprawling Studebaker conglomerate was fighting for its very survival. The disastrous merger with Packard had left the company financially crippled, and the newly appointed corporate leadership viewed building cars as a toxic liability. However, a small, fiercely dedicated group of engineers and executives in South Bend refused to surrender their proud manufacturing legacy without one final desperate fight. They realized they could never match the massive production volume or limitless marketing budgets of Ford and General Motors in the traditional full-size car market. Instead, they decided to exploit a narrow gap in the American automotive landscape. In 1959, they introduced the Studebaker Lark, a cleverly designed compact car that utilized existing chassis components but dramatically shortened the front and rear overhangs. This created a practical vehicle that was incredibly easy to park yet maintained comfortable interior space for 6 adult passengers. The Lark was a brilliant strategic pivot. It arrived perfectly timed to catch a brief economic recession and a sudden consumer shift toward fuel efficiency. For a brief, shining moment, the strategy worked flawlessly. The Lark was an immediate commercial sensation, generating massive, unexpected profits and single-handedly pulling the corporation back from the absolute brink of bankruptcy. The South Bend factory hummed with renewed energy, and hopeful employees genuinely believed they had finally turned the corner. Sadly, this triumph was brutally short-lived. The giant corporations in Detroit had closely watched the unexpected success of the Lark and immediately realized the massive financial potential of the emerging compact car market. By 1960, the Big Three unleashed their own heavily funded compact models, introducing vehicles like the Ford Falcon, the Chevrolet Corvair, and the Plymouth Valiant. Backed by massive advertising campaigns and sprawling dealership networks, these new competitors flooded the market. The Studebaker Lark was instantly overwhelmed by this tidal wave of corporate competition, and its sales collapsed almost as quickly as they had begun. The automotive division was once again plunging deep into the red, losing millions of dollars every single month. Desperate to recapture the public imagination and prove they could still build world-class vehicles, the board appointed a dynamic new president named Sherwood Egbert in 1961. Egbert was a determined outsider with a background in the aviation industry, and he brought a bold, aggressive vision to the demoralized management team in South Bend. He firmly believed the company desperately needed a spectacular halo car to repair its battered public image, generate intense media excitement, and draw curious buyers back into the rapidly emptying showrooms. Egbert secretly contacted the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy and gave his specialized team an impossibly tight deadline of just 40 days to design a revolutionary new sports car from scratch. The stunning result was the Studebaker Avanti, a breathtaking masterpiece of automotive design that looked completely unlike anything else on the road. Introduced to widespread acclaim in 1962, the Avanti featured an advanced fiberglass body, a sleek aerodynamic profile entirely absent of a traditional front grille, and innovative safety features like a built-in roll bar. With an optional supercharged engine, the Avanti proved its engineering pedigree by shattering numerous land speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats. The automotive press was absolutely captivated, praising its bold European styling and impressive performance. Initial public demand wildly exceeded all corporate expectations, and it seemed as though Egbert and his dedicated team had pulled off an incredible automotive miracle. However, the ambitious project quickly devolved into a catastrophic manufacturing nightmare that would ultimately seal the fate of the company. Studebaker lacked the internal expertise and proper facilities to produce the complex fiberglass body panels in high volumes, so they outsourced the work to a specialized external vendor. This vendor fundamentally failed to meet the demanding production tolerances required for the advanced design, resulting in severe quality control issues and mismatched bodies that simply did not fit the chassis perfectly. Dealerships across the country were flooded with eager customers waving blank checks, but the South Bend factory simply could not deliver the finished cars. The frustrating production delays stretched from weeks into agonizing months. By the time the complex manufacturing issues were finally resolved and flawless cars started rolling off the assembly line in steady numbers, the crucial market momentum had completely evaporated. Frustrated customers simply canceled their pending orders and walked across the street to buy Chevrolet Corvettes instead. The Avanti, beautifully designed to be the ultimate shining savior of the Studebaker brand, instead became a painful, highly visible symbol of its deep operational dysfunction. The massive financial losses and public embarrassment incurred by the Avanti project completely destroyed whatever remaining patience the board of directors held for the struggling automotive division. The financial managers who controlled the massive conglomerate looked at the disastrous balance sheets and made their final chilling calculation. The century-old tradition of building vehicles in South Bend had become an expensive burden that they were absolutely no longer willing to carry. The corporate executioners quietly began sharpening their axes, preparing to end a historic legacy that had proudly begun with horse-drawn wagons. Chapter 8: Black Friday in South Bend. The autumn of 1963 brought a bitter chill to northern Indiana, but the coldest reality was unfolding inside the corporate boardrooms of the Studebaker conglomerate. Despite the desperate, heroic efforts of the engineering team and the brief glimmer of hope provided by the Lark and the Avanti, the automotive division was bleeding out. The financial executives in charge of the diversified corporation had finally reached the absolute limit of their tolerance. They looked at the relentless monthly losses, the aging factory infrastructure, and the shrinking market share, and they made a cold, calculated decision. The historic South Bend assembly plant, the very beating heart of the Studebaker empire for more than a century, had to be shut down. The execution order was drafted in secret, kept tightly under wraps by top management to prevent mass panic and unauthorized strikes on the factory floor. On Monday, December 9, 1963, the rumors that had been whispering through the city for weeks finally materialized into a devastating public announcement. In a brief, sterilized press conference, the corporate leadership declared that all automotive production in South Bend would cease immediately. The timing of the announcement was incredibly cruel. It was delivered just 2 weeks before Christmas, a period when families were preparing for the holidays and heavily relying on their steady factory paychecks. For the city of South Bend, the news was not just an economic setback. It was an apocalyptic event. Studebaker was not merely an employer. It was the central pillar of the local economy, deeply woven into the social fabric of the community. Generations of families had proudly worn the Studebaker uniform. Small businesses, restaurants, suppliers, and local services all depended entirely on the wages generated by the massive plant. The immediate impact of the closure was staggering. More than 7,000 dedicated workers were abruptly terminated, stripped of their livelihoods with virtually no advanced warning. Men and women who had dedicated 20, 30, or even 40 years of their lives to building cars suddenly found themselves standing on the street, holding worthless severance notices. The initial reaction across the factory floor was a mixture of profound shock and absolute disbelief. Workers gathered in the expansive parking lots and the union halls, their faces etched with confusion and rising anger. They had loyally endured the brutal price wars, accepted the painful compromises of the Packard merger, and worked exhausting shifts to get the troubled Avanti into production. They believed they had a sacred pact with the company, an unspoken agreement that their hard work guaranteed their future security. That illusion was violently shattered in a single afternoon. As the reality of the situation set in, the vibrant city of South Bend descended into an eerie, unnatural quiet. The massive brick buildings of the Studebaker complex, which had vibrated with the deafening roar of heavy machinery for decades, slowly went silent. The towering smokestacks stopped breathing fire into the Indiana sky. Inside the plant, the final stages of the shutdown were carried out with a grim, funereal precision. Partially assembled vehicles were rushed down the line, completed with a somber efficiency by men who knew they were essentially digging their own professional graves. On December 20th, 1963, the very last Studebaker automobile produced in the United States, a red Lark Daytona hardtop, slowly rolled off the final assembly line. There was no celebration, no corporate fanfare, and no speeches. The workforce gathered around the vehicle in absolute silence. Hardened, veteran auto workers wept openly as the car was driven away toward the loading docks. It was the definitive end of an era. The company that had proudly supplied wagons to the Union Army and revolutionized post-war automotive design had finally surrendered. The corporate leadership attempted to soften the blow by announcing that a heavily scaled-down version of vehicle production would continue at a much smaller, non-union plant in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. However, everyone in the industry clearly understood that this was merely a temporary, face-saving measure designed to slowly phase out the brand and liquidate the remaining dealer inventory. The true heart and soul of Studebaker had died on the cold concrete floors of South Bend. The financial managers had successfully eliminated their biggest liability, protecting the quarterly earnings of their diversified conglomerate. But in doing so, they triggered an economic catastrophe that would ravage the local community for decades, and they set the stage for an even darker scandal involving the very workers they had just abandoned. Chapter 9. The most catastrophic pension default in history. The closure of the South Bend assembly plant in December 1963 was an immediate economic disaster for thousands of families, but the true nightmare for the Studebaker workforce was just beginning to unfold. As the initial shock of losing their weekly paychecks began to settle, a second and far more devastating realization swept through the community. The older workers, many of whom had dedicated over 40 years of their lives to the company, turned their anxious attention to the pension plan they had been promised. For decades, the labor union had negotiated these retirement benefits in good faith. Workers had routinely accepted smaller hourly wage increases during tense contract negotiations, specifically to ensure that their pensions would be secure when they finally reached the end of their working years. They deeply believed that their deferred compensation was safely locked away, acting as a guaranteed reward for a lifetime of hard physical labor and unwavering loyalty to the brand. However, when the factory doors permanently closed, the workers discovered a horrifying financial reality hidden deep within the corporate ledgers. The Studebaker pension fund was massively underfunded. During the prolonged financial struggles of the 1950s and early 1960s, the corporate executives had continually failed to deposit enough cash into the retirement accounts to cover the enormous promises they had made to the workforce. At that specific time in American history, there were very few federal laws actively regulating private corporate pension plans. Companies were not legally required to maintain strict funding levels, and there was absolutely no government insurance program designed to protect workers if a fund suddenly went bankrupt. When Studebaker officially terminated the pension plan upon the closure of the South Bend facility, the brutal arithmetic of the betrayal became painfully clear to everyone involved. There was only enough money left in the fund to provide full pensions to the specific group of workers who had already reached the official retirement age of 60. For everyone else in the company, the results were completely catastrophic. thousands of loyal employees who were in their late 50s, men who had worked tirelessly at the plant for over 30 years and were just months away from qualifying for full retirement benefits, found themselves stripped of almost everything. They received only a tiny fraction of the money they had rightfully earned, often distributed in a single, pathetic lump sum settlement that amounted to mere pennies on the dollar. Younger workers with 10 or 20 years of seniority, people who had planned to build their entire careers at the factory, received absolutely nothing at all for their years of service. The human cost of this monumental corporate failure was staggering to witness. Men who had survived the bitter hardships of the Great Depression and fought bravely in World War II were suddenly left completely destitute in their twilight years. They were far too old to easily find new jobs in heavy manufacturing, yet they were entirely stripped of the financial safety net they had spent their entire adult lives building. The profound sense of betrayal crushed the very spirit of South Bend. The workers finally realized that the corporation had not just taken away their current jobs, the executives had effectively stolen their futures to protect the bottom line. This brutal financial abandonment quickly transformed the Studebaker collapse from a localized industrial tragedy into a massive national scandal. The heartbreaking story of thousands of aging workers being left with nothing but broken promises outraged the American public from coast to coast. Newspaper editorials across the country fiercely condemned the blatant corporate negligence and the severe lack of regulatory oversight that allowed such a disaster to occur. Labor unions immediately mobilized their members, pointing to South Bend as terrifying, undeniable proof that corporate promises were fundamentally worthless without strict federal protection. Politicians in Washington could no longer ignore the glaring, fatal flaw in the private welfare system. The absolute ruin of the Studebaker workers laid bare the harsh, unforgiving realities of industrial capitalism. It demonstrated exactly what happens when detached financial managers are allowed to prioritize short-term corporate survival over their long-term obligations to human beings. The tragedy in Indiana ignited a furious, decade-long political battle for legislative reform, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in how the nation would handle worker protections moving forward. Chapter 10. Legacy from the Ruins. The tragic closure of the Studebaker plant and the subsequent pension disaster sent shockwaves far beyond the city limits of South Bend. The heartbreaking images of elderly workers left with absolutely nothing after decades of loyal service struck a deep nerve with the American public. The sheer scale of the financial betrayal transformed a local business failure into a massive national rallying cry for labor reform. For years, politicians in Washington held intense congressional hearings, using the fallen automaker as the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate greed and regulatory neglect. Former employees testified before lawmakers, recounting how their secure retirements had vanished overnight simply because financial managers decided to liquidate the company. Their powerful voices fueled a relentless, decade-long political battle that finally culminated in a landmark legislative victory. In 1974, the federal government passed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, commonly known as ERISA. This vital legislation fundamentally changed the American workplace. It established strict minimum funding standards for private pension plans and created a federal insurance program to protect workers if their employers ever went bankrupt. While this new law arrived far too late to save the thousands of men and women who had built Studebaker vehicles, their immense suffering ultimately provided a permanent shield of financial protection for millions of future American workers. Meanwhile, back in Indiana, the physical remnants of the once mighty Studebaker empire were slowly being reclaimed by nature and neglect. The sprawling, multi-story brick factories that had churned out horse-drawn wagons for the Union Army and sleek post-war automobiles for a booming middle class now stood entirely empty. The massive complex covering nearly 100 acres of the city center became a haunting industrial ghost town. Broken windows stared out over deserted parking lots where weeds violently pushed their way through the cracking asphalt. The towering smokestacks, which had proudly defined the South Bend skyline for generations, were eventually targeted for demolition. Watching the wrecking balls smash into the historic brickwork felt like a final, devastating blow to a community that was still struggling to rebuild its identity. The total erasure of the physical plant mirrored the complete disappearance of a brand that had existed for 111 years. The story of Studebaker is much more than just a footnote in the vast history of American manufacturing. It stands as a profound, enduring lesson about the fragile nature of corporate empires. The company survived the difficult transition from wagons to internal combustion engines. It successfully navigated the absolute depths of the Great Depression and contributed massively to the war effort during World War II. It proved that a smaller, independent manufacturer could briefly outsmart the Detroit giants with brilliant design and daring innovation. However, the ultimate downfall of the company was not caused by a failure of engineering or a lack of dedication from its workforce. The empire collapsed when the critical balance of power shifted away from the people who passionately loved building cars and fell into the hands of executives who only understood how to read balance sheets. When corporate leadership views a proud manufacturing legacy simply as a disposable asset or a tax write-off within a diversified conglomerate, the soul of the company is inevitably destroyed. The financial managers who orchestrated the chaotic Packard merger and the subsequent diversification strategy failed to realize that building great automobiles requires a long-term commitment to quality and a deep respect for the people on the assembly line. They prioritized immediate quarterly profits over the slow, steady investment required to stay competitive. In their desperate rush to extract financial value, they dismantled an institution that had taken more than a century to build. Today, the Studebaker name is largely forgotten by the general public, remembered primarily by dedicated classic car enthusiasts and historians. But the legacy of its spectacular rise and tragic fall remains an essential chapter in the story of American industry. It serves as a stark reminder that true business greatness cannot be sustained by financial engineering alone, and that the ultimate cost of corporate mismanagement is always paid by the workers left standing in the ruins.